So I think that we will start today our talk within the Demography Today lecture series sponsored by the BBVA Foundation and co-organized with the Spanish National Research Council and the Horizon 2020 LOMPOP project. And within our lecture series, we have today the opportunity to listen to some applied research on epidemics and pandemics and modeling these pandemics and epidemics. And we are very lucky to have here Wladimir Alonso. Wladimir Alonso is a PhD from the University of Oxford on epidemiology. His contributions to both basic and applied science are reflected in over 2,000 citations of articles published in major scientific journals. Since 2006, he is a research fellow at the Fogarty International Center at the National Institutes of Health. And his work has concentrated on global health research. And within that, Wladimir is a pioneer on analysis of latitudinal gradients of seasonal parameters of diseases, later adopted by US Center for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, and other institutions. And as well on the analysis of influenza at different stages, kind of more actual influenza epidemics and historical ones. And within those ones, he has done recommendations for the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic and other public health emergencies on how to proceed with the vaccination in a better way. So his biography is not only scientific, it's as well applied biography, a very interesting one, and I'm sure that we will enjoy very much your talk on your experience in this area. So as usual, we have between 1 hour or 1 hour and something for the talk, and then we will open the floor for questions. So welcome, Wladimir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diego. Because I like to lay positions that induce debate and controversy, so let me disclaim that this talk contains opinions that are solely mine and do not necessarily represent the views of any of the institutions, collaborators, or clients of Origin Scientifica, that is the consultancy company that we have. So, as part of the web of life in this planet, we are exposed to a fantastic diversity of organisms which can parasite us, causing us from nothing or small discomforts to very disturbing illness, suffering, and death. This is a fight in many fronts. And we want to be able to know who are our current and future enemies. One of the ways of understanding the complexity in a battle is by simplifying it with models that can be useful for us. So this is a very difficult and dicey thing to do, even if the world will be static. But it's not. And we know we live in a world that changes all the time, demographically, technologically, socioeconomically, environmentally, and so on. And this modeling field has been booming in epidemiology and to a great extent stretching too far that what actually can accomplish. This is something that I would like to discuss with you during this talk. But I believe that if we adjust correctly our expectation for these two modeling, it can become a powerful ally instead of a stimulator of even greater crisis. So I'm going to present here an analysis of models considering that despite all diversity of modeling approach, it's fair to roughly classify them into two general ones, okay? First, models that assume that a system can be understood by examining the working of its individual components and how they interact, okay? We call those mechanistic. If we want to design a better wing, for instance, we can create a set of mathematical equations that captures all relevant forces, turbulence in the gas, friction, etc., involved in this physical system. And then we can come with the best shape for that wing. In theory, if we got all the math and physics correctly, we wouldn't even need to know to test that wing, right? If we can bring all the key components in that modeling. So this is a mechanistic one. And then we have empirical ones. The second class, these empiricals are based on observations. And here you don't need to understand the relationships of individual parts of the system or why the system behaves in the way it does. An empirical model of a new wing would be based, for instance, in putting in a wind tunnel the different shapes, right? And tweaking its design until it works fine. In this case, in theory, you don't need to know anything about physics and mathematics, just trial and error, right? And in epidemiology, they mostly consist on statistical relationships among groups or variables that, again, you don't need necessarily to understand them. So how reliable can these models types be to make predictions, right? So mechanistic ones, the predictions depend on describing correctly the key components of a system. And you need also availability for these components. You need the projection for future scenarios, right? Empirical ones, the predictions depend on being able to test intensively the robustness of a model under a full range of plausible scenarios. Okay, so those are the impositions that we have in each one of them if we want to make predictions. This is, for instance, an epidemiological model that is built on knowledge and of key components of the system. This classic model of malaria dynamics captures all the key components of the transmission. It's a fine example of a mechanistic model in epidemiology. And its many derivations actually had been very helpful to understand disease patterns and to help in campaigns to eliminate malaria in many places. But this is happening in a complex world where winds, temperature, position of each host and vector, human behavior, policies can influence heavily its evolution and the extent in which it spreads. And when we don't have knowledge on the state of all the key elements in the future, predictions become quickly useless. So I'm going to explain, to try to convey the key points about how I believe that we have to be careful about the predictive modeling to make it even more useful, or see when we cannot do it. I'm going to use the disease that I've been studying for 10 years, right? And I'm going to see, we are going to use three aspects: the evasive estimates of burden, the conundrum of seasonality, and pandemic forecast. Burden, okay? We are not going to talk now about prediction. We are going to just see the limitation of knowing something as basic as the burden. How many people die every year of one disease, okay? It's something that if we think that we can do projections to the future, at least we should be able to do this, the present, right? Because it's important to bear in mind that this is one of the most studied infectious diseases of our time. One disease in which we spend millions of dollars of our national budgets to understand, prevent, and treat. And we do have an estimate, right? Between 200,000 and 500,000 by the WHO. Quantifying the burden of not only influenza, but most of diseases is notably difficult. And in our example of influenza, we can cite the following problems. You know, not all sufferers consult a doctor, so we likely have an underreporting. Laboratory testing is rarely performed. Its epidemiological profile and clinical manifestations are similar to the other pathogens. And influenza usually acts in conjunction with other conditions and pathogens, for example, by facilitating secondary bacterial infections or infecting individuals who are already vulnerable due to pre-existing conditions. Therefore, given all of these difficulties, estimating the burden of influenza has been done with the use of models. And empirical models, as we remember, need testing, right? But if we create empirical models to estimate the burden of a disease, the obvious problem is that we don't know whether those models are working correctly or not. So we don't have a benchmark against which to judge the correctness. So empirical modeling is quite difficult, even for something as basic as calculating the burden for present data. Still, it has been widely used. This is the case of the analysis of excess mortality for seasonal influenza, a method which compares observed mortality rates with a seasonal baseline, this red one, representing mortality in the absence of influenza circulation. So these models are based on the assumption that the difference in mortality from year to year are caused by influenza. The problem is that it is becoming increasingly clear that other pathogens, including other respiratory viruses, can also be behind these peaks. So if you only point your light, your torch, to influenza or a few pathogens, your results will tell you that most of the unexplained variation in mortality from year to year is due to influenza. It's not going. Here we go. And then mechanistic. Let's see how mechanistic models can do in this case. We have actually newer methods that estimate the burden attributable to influenza by directly using viral circulation data. So you regress several outcomes that span a range of sensitivity and specificity, right, from all causes to respiratory diseases, against data on viral circulation. Most often, you use the main pathogens that are influenza and RSV to determine the fraction of those outcomes that are likely caused by the viruses, while controlling for possible confounding trends. That means that those models would capture the variability considering the levels of circulation of influenza and at least another virus, the RSV. But even if accurate, we will not be able to use those models for prediction because we will need to predict the virus that will be circulating and its severity, right? So here we can, at least with these new methods, use it for estimating current burden. So it's interesting because this number that WHO divulgates, actually we don't know where it came from. And there is not a paper that published these, the calculations for this one. But we need to know, the burden of the current burden of influenza. So we actually took advantage of the 2009 pandemic. Because what happens in 2009, Diego knows, he studies a lot, the 1918 pandemic, for instance, that you have something that goes normal, and then all of a sudden you have something that, it's completely different. And then you can attribute actually that excess to the pandemic. So what we did, actually, we used, at that time, we took the data from Argentina that was perhaps the country that was more severely affected with influenza. And they had a very good account of each case of that was hospitalized or died. So they knew that it was really influenza or that it probably was influenza. And then actually we took that information and say, well, if for Argentina, the pandemic one, that is something that is being very different, from the other years, is being more aggressive. If you know exactly what is going on in Argentina, if you extrapolate for the rest of the world, actually you can calculate the upper limit of the seasonal influenza, because the seasonal influenza is usually much smaller than the pandemic influenza. And we came up with this number. We submitted to three journals, was not accepted at the time when it actually could be useful, 2009. After 2 years and 3 years, other teams published these figures with more complicated methods and with more data, because they had retrospective data for the whole world. And it's interesting, as you can see, that here we have 228,285, 163 was what was caused in a pandemic year due to influenza. And what that tells us, that all estimates for flu pandemic, which caused higher use of hospital beds, ICUs, and other healthcare facilities than seasonal influenza, indicated that less than 250,000 deaths occurred during the pandemic year. Yet the figure that is cited constantly for seasonal influenza is between 250 and 500 deaths a year. So what I'm saying to you is that even for a disease that we know a lot about it, that we study, that we face it every year in the developed world, in the developing world, you have these basic problems. So that actually can be influencing, maybe bending the policies to allocating money for influenza that perhaps should be allocated for other problems. We don't know. The problem is that we still don't know even something as basic as that. And there is also a problem. This is another paper. It was accepted. Influenza burden in Brazil. We saw that in many equatorial countries that are now adopting the flu vaccine based on the high burden figures, might be that influenza burden is actually not that large as it was thought until now. As you see here, this is the excess mortality that we had for the different states of Brazil. And it's interesting because in the south of Brazil, that is close to Argentina, you had a lot of cases of influenza and death. But as you move to the equatorial regions, actually in some places, you had even less death than other years, right? So it seems that in equatorial regions, at least the pandemic was not a big deal. And they found that also in other places, in Africa and so on. So maybe seasonal influenza is also not a big deal in those places. We still don't know something as basic about as that. Good news, right? So there is actually this beautiful project, it's a revolutionary initiative in the field of epidemiology that is happening in this moment, with the creation of the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington. And among their projects, they have one that is called the Global Burden of Disease. Their objective is to provide a comprehensive picture of what disables and kills people across countries, times, age, and sex. And their data collection, computational, analytical, intellectual capabilities are truly extraordinary. And for one of the interesting things for us is that because they are looking at everything at the same time, there is less danger of having the focus problem that I mentioned before. Actually, I would like to encourage you to, if you haven't done so, to go to their website and inspect, the results that they make available. You can go and select age groups, countries, disease risks and so on. And this is, for instance, one of the graphics that they produced for Spain, right? I selected Spain. And those are the causes of death. And I'm sorry, let me see, disease. Oh no, those are the years lived with disabilities. So those are the things in health that actually are making Spaniards suffer, right? That are removing quality of life of them. And as you can see here is back and neck problems, right? Sensorial problems, depression, anxiety. And that's a very interesting picture because it allows, public health policies to allocate the money and so on. And it's interesting that actually the part that is dedicated to the respiratory infections is not that big here, right? Is this, I think that you cannot see now here here it is, right? And you can change, select, instead of what affects quality of life, you can inspect what actually kills people. And of course, then you have that respiratory infections here is bigger, right? But it's interesting to look and compare with other, this is in Spain, right? If you would look at Bangladesh and so on, it will be completely different, of course. But Alzheimer, stroke, IHD, and so on. So beautiful stuff going on to calculate burden of diseases. So seasonality now. Let's see how the models do respect to seasonality of influenza. The seasonality of diseases were well known even in ancient times, right? Some diseases like diarrhea happen more in summer, and others more in winter, right? Like respiratory infections. Knowing the seasonality is a very important piece of information because it allows you to predict when the disease will come next year and be prepared for it. So let's, if all you want to know is something simple, such as the timing of the epidemic season in the next year, that actually is quite straightforward to do with modeling. Because by definition, seasonality is a phenomenon, that repeats itself through years. And empirical models can be tested continuously, right? So this is one model that most of us use to describe the seasonality. You see the red line here is describing very well the empirical signal on the back. It does a very good job, but actually it's not a big deal. It's just describing what is happening next year as a kind of average of what went on in the previous one. In the case of influenza, it's obvious that vaccines must be given before annual epidemic season, right? That, as we know here in Spain, is between December and January. Is when you have, the circulation of influenza mainly. So the flu shots are offered in October and November, right? Because you want to prepare the population for the peak of influenza circulation. And with the hope that they will protect us against the strains that will be circulating in the next epidemic season. So when you do that for those are the countries that send the data to the WHO, the influenza data. I put them in sorted by the latitude of their capitals. So here, those are the countries in the southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere. As you can see, influenza circulates, of course, in winter, right? In the northern hemisphere. And it does the same, but here is in the middle of the year, in the southernmost countries, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, Chile, and so on, right? So for those ones, that thing that we showed works very well, right? You just give before winter. What happens is that, here in tropical areas, as you see, the things is much more complicated, right? So there, as we showed, this was the first study we did in, it was the pioneering work on the latitudinal description of seasonal components. And it was quite interesting because, as you see, these are the timing of the year in which you have pneumonia and influenza death, right? And then those correspond to these states. So, of course, the southern states of Brazil, they have more death of respiratory diseases in June, July, that is our winter there, right? Their winter. But what happened is that actually something interesting. You had more influenza and pneumonia death before these places where the population, as you can see here by the logarithm of the populations, are bigger. You would expect that the influenza would come here and spread to other places every year, but it's not what happened. First, it circulates in the north and northeast, and then in the south. So that was an interesting finding, and something that had implications for public health as well. Because actually here, the vaccination might be not well timed. And actually these are pneumonia and influenza death, but when you put the virus, actually it circulates even a bit earlier. So this means that we are giving the vaccine at the wrong time in those equatorial regions. And in fact, using that same analysis, we published this, with the same data set that you saw of the WHO, we published recently these analyses that are the same ones of the Brazilian. Okay, so those are the month of the year, December, January, February, and so on. This is the latitude, right? Equator here. And as you can see, it's quite interesting because many, so those there, they are in the right moment. They are, it's like Spain is there and so on. The virus is circulating in this time of the year. They are in the northern hemisphere. But here, these guys are in the southern hemisphere, and the influenza is circulating with them there. That's why we put this blue box, because actually these guys should receive the northern hemisphere vaccine. This looks trivial, but mainly for countries that have few resources, equatorial, tropical countries, most of them are developing countries, is a big deal. And here is the same. Some of them are now starting the influenza program. So this is a very interesting piece of vaccination. So, you can call that predictive modeling. Yes, you can. What we did is just predicted in a very simple way, right? And actually, this analysis we did with this program, we make it available. Anyone can, with their data, you can download it and install, and you can do the same analysis with your data or with those ones that we leave as an example. But what when we try to predict the behavior of each epidemic within each year, okay? Because one thing is saying that, okay, it's circulating in this time of the year, and another is wanting to know the exact shape that you are going to have the next year, right? As we can see, although there is a moment in the year where the influenza virus circulates more, it can vary significantly from year to year. Can we predict that? Let's use the two sort of models, right? So empirical ones. Maybe you heard about the Google trend. So the Google trends is a kind of empirical ones, right? You don't need to understand what goes on there. You don't need to understand the virus, how it evolves, which strains are going. You just look, correlates with that. That is the search that people do. And doing it beautifully with big data and so on, they created that method, right? That approach. But actually in 2013, we had an epic failure, had been called, of Google flu trends. It was predicting more than double the proportion of doctor visits of influenza-like illness, right? And than the CDC was doing. And that was bad. It was bad enough for them to close it. Thank you for stopping by. We are closing here, no longer publishing it. So it's really difficult to do empirical models trying to predict to the future because you are using correlates. You are not dealing with the mechanisms of the disease. Okay, so let's try to see what we can do then if we want to predict what's going to be the shape of the season, the next season. The CDC considers this such an important endeavor that actually they had, I don't know if they're still having a competition to select the best predictive model that can do this. Their goal, they say, is the goal of this infectious disease forecasting is to provide a more timely and forward-looking tool that predicts rather than monitors flu activity, so that health officials can be more proactive in their prediction and mitigation responses. And so they have these, and all these guys are the ones that are predicting what is going to happen, right? Well, the winner of this competition published his model at the PNS, the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, in 2012. And it's a quite complicated model, but I'm going to dissect it in its fundamental parts. It's not going to be boring, I promise you, very quick. The mechanistic versus the empirical approach that I've been mentioning. So they have, the model is based on a population-level influenza dynamics, which basically means that it assumes that people who get infected by one virus cannot get infected again, usually because it gets immune, but it can also be because they die. This is a mechanistic part of the model, okay? And then it's optimized using Google Flu Trends that, as we saw before, is an empirical approach, right? And finally, it uses an extrinsic effect, right? Which is a mechanic approach too, that says that absolute humidity modulates the transmission rates of the virus, okay? So now you're trying to see, you say, okay, I understand how the virus, what causes it to be more in one moment of the year, and I think that is absolute humidity, then I'm gonna use that in the model. And it does it by altering the reproductive number, that is how fast the virus spreads in the population, through an exponential relationship, similar to how absolute humidity has been shown to affect both influenza virus survival and transmission in laboratory experiments. Okay, so that very complicated model, if you dissect it, it has these components, right? So this is the thing. It's based explicitly on a hypothesis of a mechanism to drive influenza seasonality, that humidity affects influenza virus survival, right? And therefore transmission. Well, as it happens, we are currently far from knowing which are the environmental drivers of influenza. You have all of these possible, routes, and they might be only one of them that is correct, might be a combination of them. You know, I don't have time to discuss this here. If you are interested, we did that review based on trying to explain the strength of each of these theories. But let me just give you what it means, the mechanistic basis that they use here. It means that if you translate that into a recommendation, it would say that instead of recommending, your kids to put a scarf in winter, So you protect, your throat against the cold air that maybe is damaging your epithelium and so on. That will be this other theory. Temperature affects immunity, that affects, the transmission of the virus. Instead of being days, that models says that, actually what you should do is to increase humidity in your room, right, of your home, because then the viruses will not be transmitting and surviving as quick as they do it in a dry condition. I'm not mocking this hypothesis, right? It has some empirical data supporting it, as all the hypotheses in this figure have. I'm just translating it in a way we can all understand how poor is the state of the understanding of the basic mechanism of influenza, okay? As I mentioned to you, one of the most studied infectious diseases of our times. Well, something that is happening nowadays is that you even don't have time to test the models. They don't work very well, so you make another paper improving it, overfitting, right? So also, complexity gives a false impression of understanding. And the increasing complexity secures approval, mainly by reviewers' fatigue. You see that huge paper full of formula equations, and so you say, yeah, it should be right. Okay, you approve, and that's it. So there is this problem of doing things that are increased in complexity, and then you cannot test it and access its basic working. And false understanding, can lead to wrong recommendations, as we saw. And overfitting leads to very little flexibility when novel situations are, of course, presented, right? This is a very important aspect that I will explore in the next and final part of the talk when talking about the pandemics. So, it's very important to identify putative sources of epidemics and pandemics. And this exercise is starting to be put in place, as I mentioned to you. This map shows actually hotspots of outbreaks and the regions identified as of higher risk, okay? So, for instance, these regions, right, India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and so on. EID, emerging infection disease hotspots, analysis attempts to correct for bias caused by an unequal distribution of surveillance resources and to make recommendations about where surveillance should be increased in response to predicted disease emergency risk. Very important work that is being carried out. But we need to be careful about the role of predictive modeling here too. Because they, for instance, say, in describing these patterns provide the first step towards pandemic prediction. Predictive models exist of future trends in socioeconomic and demographic drivers and might be used to derive predictive models of future trends in disease emergence. Okay? So let's go back to influenza and see what we have about this. All of you know about the 1918 badly called Spanish influenza, right? More people died there than in the Great War that was ending that year. And in fact, some historians argue that it had a big role in the defeat of the Germans as they caught it first, debilitating greatly their troops. So, of course, we got surprised, and no wonder. At that point, we knew almost nothing about the disease, and even that it was caused by a virus. But a lot of progress have been done since then. We have been studying influenza for a century. We know the genome. We developed vaccines, antivirus. We have a network of laboratories all over the world collecting data. But the 2009 pandemic caught us again by surprise, right? Despite all advances, we were not able to stop it. And if this pandemic had a higher mortality rate, I mean, we can even compare this pandemic with the 1918. 1918 was a complete disaster that almost broke the existence of society in some places. And the 2009 was real mild. But so if it were like that one, we would have been in trouble. And how we got it, so the 2009, we had models and so on and predictions. We got wrong the continent, the virus type, the severity, and even we did, I don't think that good recommendations at that time. So let's study with that contrast of the mechanistic against the epidemiologic, empirical ones. We have to dismiss straight away the possibility of using empirical modeling for pandemic preparation, okay? No way. Simply because they are, fortunately, rare events, and there is no way of testing any model, okay? So no way of using empirical modeling to predict pandemics. But mechanistic, we will need to rely on capturing correctly the key components of virus evolution, movement of host species, individuals' behavior, environmental conditions, catastrophes, natural or human-made, socioeconomics, demographics, etc., etc. So, epidemic risk maps can guide research and sensible public health interventions. But I don't believe that pandemic prediction is possible, okay? And then what I think that we can do, the alternative analytical framework, we publish a bit of that in this paper, is a shift from predicting individual diseases patterns and threats into the future, but identifying interventions that build resilience among populations to a wide range of putative stressors, increasing ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Okay? If you are still not convinced about the H1N1 2000 pandemic, what contained it? I believe that nothing. It spread all over the world. Vaccination was obviously late. I mean, vaccination takes several years, several months to produce, mainly with a novel virus. And antivirals were sadly broadly discouraged. And actually, what really helped from my point of view, it was the existing health system, that took care of the patients and so on, the basic medical knowledge that enable good care of patients. And what contained the Zika outbreak? All of you know the Zika outbreak, right? Again, nothing. It just spread in any places that you have Aedes aegypti, in Latin America, it spread, right? Where you had the dengue, you had Zika or probably will have. And we had problems, slow data sharing, right? What helped at that time? Again, existing health systems and individually treated and individuals that treated patients. And existing research capabilities. And what contained Ebola? Actually, it was not a plan that we had for the Ebola or something like that. It was the Doctor Without Borders that did a fantastic job, stretched their capability there. Public health workers and volunteers from those countries. The US military that went there and installed several hospitals and so on. Basic and sound knowledge of the disease and the existing infrastructure to mitigate outbreaks of polio in Nigeria. The country would not have been able to respond so swiftly. There is a research that says if it had not a history of responding to public health emergencies such as recurrent cholera, Lassa fever outbreaks, and a and lead poisoning, and developed an appropriate response capability also to the polio and so on. So as you can see, it is installed capabilities that took care of the outbreak. So what worked in those cases? Rapid response capabilities, healthcare provided by installed facilities, scientific knowledge, and solidarity provided by families, friends, and community. That's it. Resources not developed specifically for pandemics, but that can be recruited when needed. So what we propose is that pandemic preparedness has to be based on the premise that we will have no idea which, where, how, and what problems we will face. Therefore, we need to identify and strengthen the capabilities that can be useful for a wide range of scenarios, and most importantly, that solve current problems too. Otherwise, people would not see the point of spending too much money on those. Examples of those, it seems that I'm talking like in very abstract ideas. No, they are not abstract. We have those, for instance. As we said, strengthen and make a healthcare system more efficient. You know? I will tell you, because I think that I still have time, I will tell you an anecdote. In Brazil, most of people of middle class and so on, they don't use the public health system, despite that you can do it, because, you know, it's not very efficient, long queues and so on. But I wanted to investigate it to have a good idea. So one day I broke my toe. I say, well, I'm going to go to the public health system. It's fantastic, the proof that I had at that moment that the problem was not necessarily lack of resources, but a bad integrated system, because I had to take 3 X-rays, you know. I had to go to 2 different hospitals. I saw, I think, that 4 doctors, and at the end of the day, I didn't have a bandage on my toe, right? So it's not a shortage of capabilities, but the healthcare system, they need to be more efficient, right? Teleconsultation, you know, teleconsultation is something that you can have a part of the consultations, mainly for respiratory diseases, that before bringing the patient that might be carrying something, you know, very contagious to the health facility, you can actually, nowadays with the system we have, you can teleconsult this person, right, the patient. And actually, these sort of things will be useful nowadays, you know, for us, of course, not everything, some part, but will be very useful in case you have a pandemic of a respiratory viruses, like a severe influenza pandemic. Catastrophe preparedness. If you are prepared for earthquakes, you are also prepared for other things like a pandemic in a great extent, you know, because when you have something very bad going on outside your home, you know, that can be a pandemic, can be whatever. If you are prepared, like, you know, for instance, New Zealand they have very policies in this sense, then I think that these measures can help in a broad spectrum of threats. And you need to have, of course, based on sound epidemiological knowledge to guide response in emergencies. It's good to teach, you know, as in many places they are doing, you know, in these hotspots as well, as we saw in Nigeria. Make communication systems less dependent on disruptive nodes. We wrote a paper on that about mobiles and so on, that they are wonderful stuff, but they are becoming more fragile to face disruptive events and so on. So it will be interesting to improve that. Speed up data sharing and publication of findings, okay? So this is how we are not saying that modeling is not useful. We are saying that prediction, trying to predict things, is probably not very, it doesn't have basis in science and in experience. And instead of that, what we can do is model to stress our model, of our society to different stressors, and see what are the measures that can respond better to a wide range of these stressors. Okay, so thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much.